Hi, I'm Dr. Shujaat Mubarik, and this is the lecture number 2 of our supply chain management course. So, primarily in this lecture, we'll be discussing about the first step of the supply chain, and within that first step, we'll be discussing about the demand forecasting and planning. For just to have a quick, brief recap, that in the last session we discussed about what the supply chain management is, and then we discussed why there's a need of the supply chain management and the various pillars of supply chain. And once we were discussing about the supply chain and its processes, we concluded and we came up with the discussion that supply chain could be divided at least into the 4 fundamental processes with its feedback. So the first process was the plan, then it was source, third was make, fourth was delivery, and then after the deliver there was a feedback for the planning. So in this lecture, I am going to discuss about the planning, what do we mean by the plan, and within the plan, what are the particular aspects we have to look at, and then I'll be discussing with you some of the various types of the planning. So moving on, you can just see, before I go toward our actual topic, everybody knows about the Walmart. And everybody knows about one thing, that behind the Walmart's slogan, everyday low prices, their supply chain management is playing a pivotal role. Everybody knows about that. But one thing which maybe lesser people know comparatively, that within the supply chain, one element is very important. Although every brick of the supply chain, every process of the Walmart supply chain is important, but among that, one aspect is very important. And what that aspect is, that is their demand planning. That is, in fact, comprehensively, if I say, that is their collaborative planning, forecasting and replenishment system. That is CPFR system of the Walmart. And a lot of experts from the various business schools and from the industry, they have explicitly mentioned that pivotal and apex reason for having a very well integrated, responsive and cost effective supply chain is the collaborative planning, forecasting, replenishment system of the Walmart. It means that demand planning, or the planning, which is the first part of our supply chain cycle, it could play a very important role in uplifting the supply chain's performance and reducing the overall cost related to the supply chain. So today we have to discuss this about that. Once we are talking about the planning, what planning we are talking about, and then before that, how do we differentiate between planning and forecasting? What are the various types of the forecasting first, and maybe what are the various horizons of the forecasting, and then we move on to the planning. So in fact, once we talk about the plan, the first pillar of supply chain, so we primarily talk about the demand planning. And once we're talking about the demand planning, so it means that the forecasting comes before the planning. First, we have to forecast that how much we have to produce, that what's our market demand, what is our market demand, and then the art of comparing, or science you can say, comparing whatever the market demand is with the internal resources of the company, with the internal resources of the firm. That's called the planning. So first we are going to discuss in this session explicitly about demand forecasting. First, let me share with you that what could be the what we can say about forecasting. How to say or how to define forecasting? Maybe an estimate of the future, as it's obvious from the slide. Somebody, maybe people go to the fortune teller, and that fortune teller is just letting you know, maybe guessing about your future, that this is going to happen, that's going to happen. So that fortune teller is trying to forecast about your life, about the events of your life. Definitely those are the just wild guesses. But here, once we are talking about the forecasting and the demand forecasting, so there are no wild guesses. There's a scientific approach, or there are the bundle of scientific approaches which would be steered together, which would be put together in order to forecast the future demand of a product. So once we say that the future forecast, so what do we mean by a good forecast? So good forecast, definitely. Whatever we are forecasting, exactly, it's happening the same thing. So that's the perfectly fine forecast. But at least it never happens the same way that a company has forecasted that its demand would be 100 million units, and then after once and actual demand was the 100 million units, there must be some gap because it's the nature of the beast, what we call it. But the gap between the forecast and actual demand in fact determine the accuracy of the forecast. So if the gap between actual demand and forecast is minimum, it's a good forecast. And if the gap is wider, it means that the wider the gap is, the bad the forecast it would be. So that's the what we call it, the good forecast. Moving on to a very important question, that what type of the forecasting would be. Normally we divide forecasting into three, you can say phases, or you can say types from the time horizon point of view. The first, obviously, and the very important, is the long term demand forecasting. We are, for example, looking at the demand of a product or a bunch of the products for the next 5 years. And primarily the long-term demand forecasting is done for taking the capex decisions, capital expenditures. For example, we want to expand something, or some business are interested to divest, or there are some of the strategic decisions they need to be taken, which would affect the business in the long run or in the long term. So for that, the long-term demand forecasting is done. Remember that in the long-term demand forecasting, the nitty-gritties, the details of the products, or the details of the forecast are lesser, and the time horizon is longer. For example, if I'm talking about a demand of a maybe of a car, so I'll take the demand of a whole car for next 5 years. I'm not in once I'll be going into the long term forecast, I may not be very much going into a detail that, for example, what would be the demand of A car, B car, or within the A, what would be the demand of the A1, B1, C1. So once we forecast for the longer term, the details are less, but the time horizon is more. As we move toward from the longer term to the medium term forecasting, which is usually done, as it is apparent from the slides, it's done from the HR planning, or we call it the manpower planning, or for the inventory planning. So that is called a medium term forecast. Usually it tends to be 6 months to 2 years, but again it depends. It's not a rule of the thumb. It depends upon the company, that how a company is taking its medium term demand in term of the time horizon. But usually it spans from 6 months to 2 years. So medium term demand is done for the manpower planning, where to deploy, how much human resource, how much inventory needs to be held in the warehouses of the companies, and what could be the other resources, that kind of the resources planning. So that's done, that's called the medium term demand forecasting. Again, the level of detail in the medium term forecasting would be higher as compared to the long term forecasting. And then we move on to that is obviously the short term forecasting. Obviously the level of detail would be much higher. In the great detail there'll be a forecasting, but the time horizon would be much less. For example, if we talk about the short term forecasting, it may be up to 1 month to a day, that what we are going to produce tomorrow, what we're going to produce next week, what we are going to deliver, or what we are going to produce in next 1 month. So it's immediate, it's short term, but the level of details are obviously they are the greater. The immense detail would be required because you want to put the things into the practical perspective. So here it's obvious that once we are talking about the short-term forecasting and short-term planning, so for that the levels of details are greater, and the time horizon is less. Now if we move on, and if we talk about that why it remains always important to forecast the demand. But there may be a lot of people, those who are saying that why it's important to forecast the demand, just produce the products, just whatever your capacity is, produce the product and send it to the market and sell the products. Why this is that this is an exercise of forecasting and all that? Why is it important? Why does it make sense? There are a lot of questions which the people would be asking. So let's come toward that. if you are not forecasting, in right way, what could be the losses? Number one, and it's very famous, that once we do not tend to forecast in the right way, we could have the two options. Number one is we have overestimated the demand of our customers, and when we have overestimated the demand of our customers, it means that we'll tend to hold excessive inventory in our warehouses. Definitely, because if, for example, the customer's demand is 10 units, and I expect or I forecast that the customer's demand may be 20 units, so I'll be holding the inventory according to a 20 units. Demand is 10 units, so it means that I'm holding 10 units inventory excessive. So I have to bear the cost of that inventory, which ultimately would be transferred to the customer. It will come into the price, and my product it would be becoming lesser competitive. So number one, right? Moving on. Number two, if for example, if you say that, okay, I am not going to overestimate the demand of my customer, there is a scenario that you can underestimate the demand. For example, the demand is 10 million units. You are being pessimist about the demand of customer. You say that it should not increase more than 5 million units. So what will happen? That you would be holding, or a company would be holding inventory of 5 million units. The customer is coming on your doorstep, or the customers are demanding the product, and there will not be any product in the market because there is no inventory, there's no raw material. So if there's no raw material, there's stocklessness. How you'll produce the product? Once you will not produce the products, how will you end up delivering the product to the customer? So it means that if the forecast is not accurate, either you'll be going to have the cost in terms of holding excessive inventory, or you are going to face the stocklessness situation, which could even cause the bigger cost, right? And what would be the ultimate effect? If you are holding the excessive cost, it would be a bullwhip effect. Obviously, for example, if I'm anticipating that my customer's demand is 20 units, and I'm holding the inventory according to that, whereas the actual demand is 10 units, my backward, or what we call the upstream supply chain, my supplier would be maintaining the inventory according to that. Maybe my supplier would be maintaining inventory according to the 20 units, and he'll be having 30 units. Then his supplier may be maintaining the even higher number of inventory. So because of the wrong and inaccurate forecast of mine, the whole of the upstream supply chain would be maintaining excessive levels of inventory. So obviously it would create a lot of burden in terms of the supply chain holding cost. So that's called, we call it the bullwhip effect. And once, if we are maintaining the lesser inventory, so obviously we'll be losing sales. So that's called, we call it the lost sales, which will end at, and which would be discussed, or which would be considered as the poor response to the market dynamics. Having these all things in the mind, it shows that demand forecasting, which is the first step in the plan pillar of supply chain, is of high significance, and companies need to take, and companies do take this very importantly. The companies do take it in a very serious, very organized, and in a very coherent manner. So we have to discuss about that. Okay, once the forecast is important, what could be its various types of the forecast? How we can really forecast demand of a company, and what could be the ways in order to minimize the actual demand, actual and forecasted quantities difference. So in this lecture, I'm just going to tell you the basic types of the forecasting. I'm not going into the detail that what each type is. In the next lecture, which would be the lecture number 3, I'll be discussing each type of the demand forecasting. But let me share with you that primarily we tend to adopt, the companies tend to adopt two ways of the demand forecasting. One is the qualitative approach and the other is quantitative approach. Obviously, it's obvious from its name that in the qualitative approach, the reliance is on the opinions, on the experiences, on the experts' perceptions about the market, maybe the opinions of the groups, opinion of an individual, opinion of an expert, opinion of maybe a manager or something. So that's the qualitative type. It has a further some approaches, which is the first one is, for example, jury of executive opinion. You may be knowing it. There's the Delphi approach. And there's again another approach which is called Salesforce composite approach, and the last but obviously not the least, that is a survey approach. These are the four prominent approaches, but these are in reality there is a long list of the approaches which are used in doing the qualitative forecasting, but we will be discussing only the four approaches here in this particular session about the qualitative. Then we move on to the quantitative forecasting or the quantitative approaches. Obviously, the quantitative it's more relying upon the data. It's excessively rely upon the data. Maybe I'm not, the use of the word excessively may not be right, but it predominantly use or rely upon the data, numbers, and based upon the numbers, based on the previous demands, based on the various data of the other indicators, the demand forecasting is done. Although again there's a long list of the quantitative forecasting techniques, and it has a complex mathematical and econometrical and statistical models at the back of a lot of demand forecasting techniques. But for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of understanding, I'll be discussing a few of the major quantitative techniques, which would be definitely include about some of the prime techniques. So this slide in fact would be showing you the various types of the quantitative technique. The first one, the quantitative technique, is it is trend adjusted exponential smoothing moving average. The second is exponential smoothing moving average. Then it's a simple moving average. Then there are the econometrical models, which could be a deal or which could be used for the demand forecasting or demand planning and forecasting. In a nutshell, we can forecast either by qualitative or quantitative in theory, but in practical or in reality, the companies tend to use both methods for forecasting of the demand. It's not, these methods are not kind of a mutually exclusive, which we call it, that if one method is to apply, the other cannot be. The both or the multiple methods could be applied for the forecasting. So here in this lecture, I just want to give you a very brief background about the forecasting techniques. In the coming lecture, I'll be discussing in detail about the qualitative types of this forecasting techniques and the quantitative techniques. Qualitative techniques obviously we'll be discussing simply as to how we can apply that or employ them. For the quantitative techniques, which we may require certain softwares, I'll be sharing some of the links with you, and I'll also be trying to demonstrate that how we can deal with the data in order to forecast about the demand. So thank you very much for watching this video, and if you want to see, or if you're interested to know about the details of qualitative demand forecasting and quantitative demand forecasting, see my lecture number 3. Thank you very much.